So this conference comes, or this workshop comes at a really great time for me. I'm working on a book project called Slipping Sideways on Alternate History. And this gave me this incredible opportunity to think about what it is that I actually mean when I say alternate. So for this paper, I would like to propose alternate, the verb, the adjective, and the noun, as a lexical concept that captures within it the potential to articulate and to expand and to challenge political imagination, which I think is what many of us are trying to do in this workshop. The work I'm doing is based on a kind of an ongoing hypothesis, kind of an underlying premise, that for far too long we've been stuck in critical and imaginative and ideological stasis. This has led us both to an ongoing discourse of crisis and of emergency, panic, and with that, an increasing exasperation with the promise of justice, justice for those wronged, and the promise of rectification for all that is wrong. Now, frankly, justice has been promised and yearned for and denied and argued over for far too long. So my thinking is, instead of fight more and harder, let's just change the script. Let's stop demanding justice and maybe find something better we can do with our time and efforts. Now, the premise that I work from naturally spirals out to a series of questions that I think will be evident to many of us. Among them are, who is this we who is stuck? Where is this context of stasis, right? So if I'm thinking about crisis in Binyamina or in Berlin or in Boston, don't the parameters of the discourse change? The impact, the price paid, and the cost borne of this dilemma, this set of questions. Who are the agents of this discourse? Who gets to talk about it? Who gets to articulate these questions? Who gets heard when they do try to have their voice heard, and who is ignored, and so on and so forth. It is in identifying these questions, their potence and their impact, in finding a language with which to articulate them, making choices of accountability and obligation, both to myself and to the people around me and to the people who I'm ignoring from the conversation and so on, and eventually cautiously offering answers to these questions, that we can begin to move out of a paralyzing language of panic or of retribution. Now, using the term alternate as a semantic framework for this process creates kind of a capacious and dynamic space in which I can play with the distance between the different poles of this word. So alternate and alternativity kind of airs out the discussion, I think, and allows us to complicate the categories. So that's nice, but what does that actually mean? So let's look for a moment at the many different options that alternate opens up for us. As a verb, alternate to alternate means to occur in turn repeatedly. We must alternate work with rest, ideally. As an adjective, it means every other or every second. The bus runs on alternate days. In North American English, it's also used often interchangeably with alternative, so taking the place of, for instance, take the alternate route to avoid traffic. As a noun, I think a little more rare, but also mainly present in North American English, it means a person who acts as a deputy or a substitute. They chose 12 jurors and 2 alternates. Now, in all these syntactic roles, alternate pushes us into a mode of change without requiring a complete abandonment of the original position. And this to me is one of the powers of this term. So unlike, say, substitution, where one is replaced by another, with alternation, we're able to keep both the original position and move past it. This way, we resist the debilitating certainties on one hand and the postmodern freefall on the other. Now, in my engagement with how political imagination plays out through language and narrative, I turn my attention to literature. I argue that contemporary novels try to push past imaginative paralysis by invoking a literary mode of alternation, specifically and increasingly by creating alternatives, parallels, extrapolations, enrichments to represented and lived history. And I think this is hardly a provocative claim to state that speculative fiction and different modes of science fiction have become much more common in both popular and so-called high art around us. Indeed, through these texts, we begin to see how the very possibility of historical representation is both problematic and political, right? So this idea that I could just capture a moment of time in language is absolutely not an obvious claim, and the attempt to do so will always have problems, and it always involves a set of political choices. Now, although beyond the scope of the paper that I'm offering here, the workshop, the larger aims of this research seek to identify in the novels a more effective construction of livable frameworks. So kind of, I'm thinking of a livable, something we can live with, a framework, as opposed to, say, a utopian ideal across transnational ties, in contrast to kind of the stasis of a national given, and composed of cohabitants, which is a term I found a while back and I thought was incredibly evocative and just super exciting, until I heard trans individuality last night, and I thought, oh, that's kind of cool too. And it'd be interesting for me to explore the relations between those, the differences and similarities between those terms. And all this is done by means of a dynamic, by means of dynamic modes of obligation. And I can talk more about obligation later, the ways in which we commit to each other and yet preserve ourselves. Alternate histories have been called many things over time. They've been called uchronia, allohistories, alternative histories, counterfactuals. Each term emphasizes and nuances slightly different structural features of the form. But I'm using a broad and inclusive definition of the form, with a hope to include those texts that distance themselves from the conventions of realist representation as they relate a series of events. Alternate history creates a doubled vision, two or more simultaneous readings, that is, an ostensible what really happened, alongside an imagined what if this had happened. Together, they put to ridicule any pretense of straightforward representation or of a reliable linear history. I'm calling attention to the teleological premise of history, that idea that one thing inevitably leads to another. Alternate histories also rework the often limiting portrayals of justice as linear. A clear and identified subject, committed B, another clearly identified act, creating a set of implications, C, or situation that is clearly identified, which must then be fixed by D, also something that is ostensibly clear. Let me explain what I mean by this. The form of alternate history works on at least two planes simultaneously, describing a point of historical divergence in which time splinters off into a new and unfamiliar path, nevertheless reaffirms the idea that time follows a path. Right, so alternate history works on this idea of a point of divergence. History is linear. There's a point in which, Hitler woke up in a better mood one day, or some general from the South sneezed, and then history took a different path. Okay, and that's the POD, the point of divergence. Nevertheless, the idea that time follows a path is reaffirmed. Causality can be traced, mapped, and measured. At the same time, however, the very fact that the novel offers a parallel timeline, an alternate to history as we know it, illuminates the utter contingency of history, the mess and the richness of random chance that dictates human progress. In other words, the very form demands the impossible of us, to recognize two seemingly mutually exclusive narratives as simultaneously true. And for me, this is truly valuable, right? This is the key to moving past that stasis and moving forward to a much more productive sense of the present and thus of the future. So what we have is an alternate literary form that pushes through realism. The form dabbles with a new kind of subject position as well, one who is decontextualized, jet-lagged, collaborated, and this is a pervasive feature of this kind of text, where you have a protagonist who is either a time traveler or someone who finds himself thinking that something's not quite right about history, and they often kind of experience this discombobulation, right? Or they're often also collaborated, and I can talk more about what I mean by that. In this way, the characters, and by implication, the readers, are repositioned beyond inherited categories, invoking a mode of criticality, which is what we want, right? We want to be able to recognize the context and separate ourselves from it so that we can change it. When we consider the possibility of forward-looking historical pasts and futural present tenses, we can see how the new multiple temporalities of alternate histories offer just such a sided resistance, each recuperating and creating new narratives of the past, both within the text and, as I've said, through the structure of alternate history by means of the text. This fiction of alternativity in contemporary transnational novels begins to offer what I recognize, as I've already said, as livable frameworks, which become the alternative to the utopian impulses that guide so much of current political rhetoric. Each of the novels I examine in the larger project articulates a frustration with utopian goals or a crisis of historical representations, and turns instead to compromise, to some mode of representation or of action that calls not to some distant idealized future, nor yearns back to any conception of the past. Rather, they establish the contemporary as a site of pragmatism, negotiation, mediation, of accountability, and through that offer a way forward. Thank you very much.